This is a wonderful event that I'm very much looking forward to. I'm Jonathan Wiesen. I'm a professor of history here at UAB, and I'm chair of the history department. And I'm very happy to present Jennifer Teege. I'll be saying a little bit something about her in a moment. But first, I want to mention, as many of you know, that this is the anniversary today of the Kristallnacht pogrom in Germany in 1938. Please keep your sounds muted, of course. Thank you. Got a lot of people here. So in 1938, 82 years ago today, as many of you know, Jews in Germany and Austria experienced an even more desperate turning point in their lives as Jews in Central Europe than they had felt even before. 2,000 synagogues were destroyed. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed by the Nazis. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And as we are now learning as well, 40 to 50,000 Jewish homes and apartments in Austria and Germany were destroyed and looted. So it's a very distressing but important anniversary that we are marking today with an important discussion by a very engaging speaker, Jennifer Teege. And I do want to thank a few people. First of all, thank you so much to UAB, the College of Arts and Sciences, for supporting this and getting us up and running. I'm also particularly grateful to the Rita C. Kimerling Public History Endowment. One of our local Birmingham fathers, if you will, Saul Kimerling, who has done so much for this community, named this endowment in honor of his late wife. The love for his wife, for his city of Birmingham, and for history in general was the inspiration behind his gift to the Department of History. And we've made good use of that with some really interesting series already. Telling difficult histories is one of them, and certainly this talk today fits into that. And I'm very happy to welcome some of the Kimerling family. Indeed, I believe that Saul Kimerling himself is here. So welcome and thank you. And I am so eager to meet you still in person. I'd also like to thank the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, which has been a great partner since I came here to UAB in 2019. Such wonderful programming and with a really powerful mission of educating students throughout the state and adults in Holocaust education and highlighting the lives and legacies of Holocaust survivors here in Alabama and beyond. Jennifer Teege caught my attention when I was doing some research on Nazi Germany and its view of Afro-Germans or Afro-Deutsch citizens. And I just happened upon her book a couple of years ago. I immediately was drawn to it. It is a best-selling book. My grandfather would have shot me. A Black woman discovers her Nazi family's Nazi past. I could not put it down. It was a beautifully and is a beautifully written story about memory and family and modern German history. And it really prods me, and I think it will prod you, and I will give information about how to get it, into thinking about our own lives and our own traumas, our own struggles over US history and over identity. Jennifer, it's wonderful to see you. We wanted to bring you here, obviously, in person, and we had that lined up, but it couldn't be. But next time, perhaps we'll get to show you some of the sights and sounds of Birmingham, and as we've talked about, the wonderful memorials in Montgomery. Jennifer Teege, I won't say much, except that she is fluent in Hebrew and in English and German. She lives in Hamburg, has worked in advertising. She has degrees at Tel Aviv University in Middle Eastern and African studies. And I could say more, but her life is much more fascinating when she tells it. So welcome, Jennifer. I'm going to start by actually showing just a short video clip. So bear with me, the technology. Let me see if I can't just do one quick thing here while I share a screen.
No, I see everyone.
You do see everyone? Okay, good. All right, so. Make one more thing here and try again.
Have you ever thought about what your bloodline says about you? Really thought about who you are? What is family? Is it something we inherit, or is it something we built? My grandfather was a psychopath, a sadist. He embodies everything that I condemn. What kind of person takes pleasure in tormenting, killing others, and inventing different ways of doing so? What do his crimes against humanity say about my place in humanity? What does his character say about mine? If he was so evil, is it even possible that I am different? How much do I resemble him? I am Jennifer Teege, the granddaughter of the Nazi concentration camp commandant Amon Good. And here's my story.
So it's up to me now, Jonathan?
It is up to you. It's over to you. I will start your slideshow again.
Okay. So first of all, hello. I can see you on the screen, which is wonderful. I'm not so used actually to do online meetings, so online talks. So this is a new experience, and we just figured out some technical difficulties. So I hope everything is going smooth. There's another thing before we start. I was at the dentist today, so it might look sometimes a little bit awkward because this is still not really paralyzed, but I excuse, hopefully it works. It hurts a little bit. I hope you don't see it, but so you know why I look maybe a little bit awkward sometimes when I talk and the mouth goes up and down. So my thanks goes also to the university, of course, but my special thanks to you, Jonathan. We had already the pleasure to meet beforehand. We talked a little bit about the program of the university, and I think that I really am a good fit by watching what you did so far. For today, I had actually prepared something, but the truth is, due to last week and due to the elections, I did actually make some changes in the talk. And it's not going to be just a talk, it's going to be first a speech, sort of, and then I really would like to engage and talk to you. So the question I would like to start with is actually, how are you? I mean, it's not only me who is probably affected by what happened last week. I mean, this was something that was felt around the world, as you can imagine, not only in the US. And how we see it from afar is it was definitely a victory for democracy, just by the tremendous turnout of people who went to vote. This was really beautiful to see. Well, this video might be shown not only at the university, maybe at some other places, and not everyone voted for the same party. You know, there were people who voted blue, there were people who voted red, there were people who voted independent. So what I think is that everyone who voted for what he or she thought was right. So what is right? This is the question, and this is a very central question that is more just a simple question. It's actually a very philosophical and a very ethical question. And these questions, or this is a question that I try, I mean, you can't solve it, but I tried at least to find an answer with you today. This is one of the goals of the talk. What I also would like to do is actually to talk about three different subjects. Obviously the past, but also the present, and most important, about the future. So let's start with the past. You watched the video, so you know a little bit about myself. But before we dive into the moment that changed my life, one could say forever, I want to explain a little bit who I am, and also why you might like to listen to me or to what I have to say. So my father is Nigerian. And my mother is German. My parents met in Germany. My father is from a small village in Nigeria. The village name is Umutu. It's in the region. It's a more rural area, and he was one of the first of his family who actually was able to leave this place and went to Germany to study. So he met my mother, and they had a brief affair. It didn't last for very long, and they separated before I was born. When I was 4 weeks old, my mother brought me to a Catholic orphanage because she couldn't care for me herself. It wasn't thought to be a solution forever, but she did decide so because she was a single mom, and at that time, it was in the 1970s, she couldn't care for me by herself. So, Jonathan, you could please show the first slide. Okay, this is a slide that you can see. This is when I was baptized. So I grew up actually under the care of the nuns for the first years. And when I was 3 years old, I had to leave the orphanage. This was not just me, all the children, because the children had to go to a follow-up institution. This was only for small babies and small children. So what they tried to do was to find families for these children, foster families, because otherwise they would have needed to go to a different follow-up institution. In my case, I was the lucky one. There was a family that was willing to take me in. It was a German family. It was a white German family. And from the age of 3 years old, I started living with the family, with my new German family. I was still seeing my mother, not very often. I saw her sporadically. She sometimes came, visited me in the orphanage, and later when I was in at the foster family, she also came, but this stopped once I was 7 years old, because at that point, I became adopted by my foster family. So after the age of 7, there was no contact with my mother for many, many years. And now we dive into the moment that I told you changed my life forever. So this was a moment that, yeah, one could also say divided my life into a before and an after. It was a sunny day in August. It was almost 10 years, or it was in 2008, so it is more than 10 years ago. And it was a sunny day. My kids were small, and they still went to kindergarten. So in the morning, I took my kids and dropped them at preschool. And my husband went to work. I continued to drive to the central library, the public library of my hometown. It's the biggest library in town. It has more than, I think, 400,000 items. And I happened to be in the psychology section. I was just walking around, and it was not the specific reason why I was in the library. I really like reading, so I go there quite often. So I happened to be in the psychology section when I saw a book on the shelf, and I could only see the spine. The book was on the shelf, so I could read the title. The title said, or it actually said, there was the author's name in the title. It said, "I have to love my father, don't I?" I didn't know anything about the author. The author's name was Matthias Kessler. Okay, Matthias Kessler. Later I found out this was a journalist, but let's not fast forward. So I took the book from the shelf, and Jonathan, you could, okay, sorry, I have a few more slides that we quickly run through so you'd see my childhood. Okay, this is me in the orphanage. Again, the next, please. This is me. It's a very cute one, I think, because it was the first night that I spent at my foster family. when I had my first visit and I had a sleepover. So this is when I was 3 years old. And there's one more. This is a picture that I also would like you to see, because I told you it was a white German family. Look at me. I mean, I'm not so dark on this specific picture, but you can imagine I always felt different because I was different. So this is my brother, my adopted brother, Matthew, who I very much, we're very close still. So anyhow, let's go back. Jonathan, next slide. This is the book that was on the shelf. So you can see the cover, and on the cover you see a small photograph of a woman, and you see it's not very clear. You can't, I mean, it's a small, tiny photograph. And in the background, you see a man with a rifle in his hand. And there where you see the white letters, it says, the life story of Monica Goethe, daughter of the concentration camp commandant from Schindler's List. So I took the book from the shelf, I had it in my hands, and I started leafing through its pages. And there was text, and there were also photographs. And there was one photograph, Jonathan, can you please show us? It was the photograph of a woman with dark hair, dark brown hair. And this picture reminded me of my mother, of my biological mother. And then there were other pictures, and there was one picture of an older woman, and she wore a summer dress, a floral dress. And for all these years, I had kept 2 photographs of my family. And one was a woman, my grandmother, with the exact same dress. So I was looking at these pictures, and then I was leading through the pages of the book, and at the very end, there was a summarization of some biographical details like where the woman was born, when she was born. And at that point, I realized, in this moment, I realized that the book that I was holding in my hand was not just a random book, but it was the book that told the story of my biological family. So imagine, I mean, it was in the library. I couldn't, I mean, this was a moment still, when I go back into that moment, it's almost impossible to describe. I just knew I had to get out of this building. I wanted to lie down somewhere. So I left the building, and outside there was a square and there were benches, and I was lying down on the bench. Then I called my husband. I told him he needs to come and pick me up. And I couldn't drive. I mean, remember, I came there with my own car. So my husband came, picked me up, and he immediately knew what this meant for me. We are married for at that point for years, and he knows about my background. So on the way back home, when we drove, we didn't speak. I didn't say a single word. So he dropped me at home, and I went into my room, and then I collapsed onto my bed. And on the bed, I started reading the book cover to cover. And only when I finished, I realized the magnitude, and I realized that Amon Goethe, the concentration camp commander, was not just a fictional character, but I understood that this was a man that really existed in flesh and blood. And what was even more, that he was my biological grandfather. So what I want you to understand is that this shock, or it was a shock, came twofold. So on the one hand, I realized who my biological grandfather was, and we will go, and I will explain you a little bit about the historical context. But what we all know, that it was someone who was of tremendous cruelty. So I did know a little bit about him, but this was a shock by itself to know who my biological grandfather was. But the second was, or the second thing was also my biological mother, who I haven't seen for so many years, suddenly diving back into my life. So everything came so quick, and everything came so out of the blue. I was completely unprepared. Because sometimes people now, and sometimes our journalists used to ask me, you know, what is it? I mean, why did you take it so hard? And I try to make people understand that it is a conglomeration of different events. They were just coming out of nowhere, and it was simply too much to deal with in such a short period of time. Later, I was diagnosed. I was diagnosed with a post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was for quite a while I wasn't really able to function. I was sleeping a lot most of the time, and I remember there was a couple of days after discovery, there was a moment. It was the moment when I was in the bathroom in my house, and I had a picture, a photograph of Amon in my hands. And I was looking at his face and at my face at the same time. And I was trying to find out or to see if there are any similarities, any physical similarities between the two of us. Because after all, we are related. And maybe Jonathan, or before you put the slide, I saw a similar line between the nose and the mouth here. And I was so scared. So Jonathan, can you show us the slide? You can see for yourself. So the question is, what does this mean? In the very beginning, I was so full of irrational thoughts that I wasn't able to think clearly. What I want you to understand is that there might be similarities, but it doesn't say anything about who you are. It doesn't say anything about who you are. And there is no such a thing as a Nazi gene. And what you have to understand is that only you are responsible for who you are and for who you become. This is a very important message for me. I give you an example. It's an example of someone who comes or has a background of a prominent Nazi family. Her name is Bettina Göring. Bettina Göring is the grandniece of Hermann Göring, who was the commander-in-chief of the German Air Force during the Nazi era. And she and her brother, they both have decided to have themselves sterilized because they wanted to end the family line. When I heard it, I thought, this is so utterly wrong, because again, you decide who you are and you decide who you want to become. It's the most important message for today. But let's continue. So what did I do with my story, and why do I share the story? I think it's a story, first of all, I'm not allowed to take to my grave. I'm the only one who can share the story, and I think it needs to be shared. It does not need to be shared because it's a story that is maybe effectful or whatsoever. No, that's not the point. it needs to be shared because it's a very, very universal story. And many elements are universal. It's not just the past. It's the past, it's also, for example, the question or the quest for identity. It's the toxic power of family secrets. There are a lot of different subjects that go along. But when we go back, and I told you, the talk is going to be about the past, the present, and the future. Let's see why such a story is important for the present and the future. I did speak over the last years for many institutions and on a variety of occasions. But what I always enjoyed most was speaking for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, because this is an institution who's dedicated to teach and educate about the Holocaust. What they do, and what they do a little bit different to other institutions, also, for example, Yad Vashem, I don't know whether you know the name, it's the biggest in Israel. It's the Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a huge, huge museum, but the focus is on remembering. It's honoring the victims. We shall not forget, and we shall keep this alive, which is very important. And the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is doing the same, but they go a step further. They also try to teach you how to take your knowledge and implement it in today's world. When we try to understand what happened over the last 4 years, we need to also think about the past. Because if you look at what happened over the last 4 years, you have to understand how fascism develops. It's, for example, threatening of international institutions. It's trying to eliminate or change the press, stuff like this. I could go on and go on and go on. And I don't want to blame anyone, but I just want you to see or to understand that there are, or there were, a lot of warning signs. So I think to educate people, not only to talk about the past, because we shall not forget, but to learn for the future is crucial. It's crucial. And you need to be a part of it. I try to do what I can do, but everyone has to contribute to that matter. So this shouldn't be advertising for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but a little bit, yes, I'd like to, because it's a living memorial and it's an academic institution. It's a research center. It's a way to educate people. And sometimes people think what happened just in Europe, and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is in Washington, DC. It's really difficult sometimes to teach people about the subject, because they don't make the connection. They just think it's in the past. It did happen, but it won't happen again. Yes, it won't happen the same way that it did happen, but it can come in a different, let's say, in a different phase. So it's important to talk about the Holocaust. And in Germany, we have mandatory school programs where we are taught about the Holocaust, which is good, because like this, you can't deny. I mean, every single child in Germany knows about what happened. And the Holocaust is not a singular event. Very often you try to, or you concentrate on figures, on leading figures, but actually it's not about people, about single people, so singular people. It's about a movement. It's about the way how you look at humanity, the way how you look at how you treat the other one. And so let's go back to my biological grandfather. Amon Goeth, I don't know how much you know about him. I mean, he became known to millions of people to the movie Schindler's List. Schindler's List is by Steven Spielberg. Amon Goeth was portrayed by Ralph Fiennes. So Amon Goeth and Ralph Fiennes, he was the one who killed the Jews, and Oskar Schindler was the one who saved the Jews. And this is a movie that is of special importance because it was a movie that did not, it was the first time that a wider audience, or you could reach a wider audience. It was not that you could only reach the intellectual. It was a movie that educated the whole world about what was happening. And this is the importance of the movie. But the movie also works with black and white, let's say it this way, because you have the good one and you have the bad one, and you don't really have something in between. The real world is not like this. For making a movie, I think it's very smart and it's also accurate, and it was a powerful movie, but the real world is a little bit different. Just keep this in mind. No. So the movie was so important because it educated a whole generation, you could say. And with the movie, with these kind of tools, where you can reach people, not only the intellectual, but where you can reach masses, where you can not only teach them, but you reach their heart. It makes things understandable, because if you talk about the Holocaust, for some people it's just a number. You know, 6 million Jews is a number that is so difficult to grasp. But if you have it, if you have a personification, one says, I think, is if it's personified, it's easier to relate to it. It's easier to get it into your heart and really feel it. So that's the importance. And if you want to change something, it really needs to be important for you. Otherwise, you won't have a voice that's loud enough. So it needs to be something that affects you in your heart. And this is actually the big advantage that I have, because the powerful story that I have, I try to use. I try to use because I know Amon Goeth was not just, you know, there were many Nazis. He was maybe not even the worst. I mean, Hitler, so on, I mean, you name it. But people really, really, by the movie, feel something. So when I talk to people, I always try to lead by a good example. And let's go back to Tina Goering, who decided to have herself and her brother as well sterilized. I decided to do exactly the opposite. Be there, go out, talk to people, try to set a positive example. So that's me. And now to you. I also, this is a talk that I give to you, but this is a university. So what is your job? I also want you somehow to go out and lead by example. But what means example? We have now, afterwards, we have a Q&A that we can talk and we can discuss things. But I think leading by example means, first of all, to acknowledge what's happened. Don't shut up. You have to say what there is, and you don't have to sugarcoat it. You maybe need to find the right words, but you have to speak out. And this is what you do, at least when I see what happened during the election. Because this is a danger. This is a danger that can come in a different form, in a different phase again. Maybe in 4 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 15 years. What is important is that people understand, and I was actually, becomes a little political. I told you that I actually prepared something else, but I have to say, because I was thrilled to see the word empathy when Biden had the first speech. Empathy is a word that I use in my talks for years. And very often, people say, oh, empathy, this is something, it's feelings, it's not politics. No, that's not true. This should be the fundament of politics, to care for the other. And when we look back, if you think about the past, what happened with the Jews, I mean, it started with a yellow star and people did not react. It always starts at one point. And if you have empathy, if you put yourself in someone else's shoes, if you can feel the pain, this is the best antidote against everything. So the question we started with, what is right? I can't give you an answer, what is right? No. There is no right and wrong. There is no black and white. But there are moral values. And there are moral values that we should put really, really on the top. And if we have these values on the top, everything else will follow. But these standards, these moral standards, it's so crucial. It's so crucial. And then you can still have different ideas, different point of views, different visions, but as long as this fundament is there, you'll be okay. That's basically what I want to say to you as my monologue. I have a few slides that I'd like to share with you. Jonathan, can we see the next one?
Sure, let me go back. And we have a lot of questions. We're going to take questions.
No, I want to show you two more slides, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
This we had. Next one. Yeah, this is, before I finish, I want to go back to one subject that I think is also important for you to know. This is my mother. This is my mother, Monica. Monica is the daughter of Amon Good. And when you see me here now talking, I wouldn't say I'm the complete opposite of my mother, but we are very different insofar that when you see her, can you see her face? I think she looks very sad and she looks very, she looks broken. She's not from the victim side, but she's broken herself. And this movie was shot in the US. It was actually a movie that was done by a filmmaker who showed the encounter between my mother and Helen Rosenzweig. Helen Rosenzweig was a servant, a maid in the household of Amon Good. And it showed, in the movie, you can see how the two women meet for the very first time. And it's a heartbreaking movie because when you see, when they come together, they meet up in the villa in Krakow where the concentration camp was, and where Helen Rosenzweig, the maid, was living and working for so many years under the roof of Amon Good. And you see the two women meeting for the first time. And when you watch the movie, you can still see the fear in the eyes of Helen by reliving what had happened to her. And you see also my mother, who is sort of crippled with guilt and pain, and it doesn't work together. It's just, there's no harmony, and they are actually a good example, or they were an example for me when I saw what I would like to do different, not be crippled by guilt, but to go out again, be there, be responsible, and hopefully set a better example. There's another slide, Jonathan. So this is again, this US Holocaust Memorial Museum. I would really like to invite you and encourage you, if you, I don't know how much knowledge you have, or if you have friends or people who are not so familiar with what the Holocaust is. And, you know, it's not that I'm saying this because I don't know the reality. When I started giving talks, I watched a clip, a YouTube clip about, it was on the campus in Pennsylvania University, and they were asking students about the Holocaust, and they were asking very simple questions, I would say, like, what is Auschwitz, for example? And there were a couple of students who couldn't give an answer, and I thought it's impossible. And then I thought, like, how could this be? And then I realized that I shouldn't feel, you know, embarrassed for these poor students because they didn't know. They didn't know better because the system doesn't work. In the US, as you all probably know, there's not a one system. So every state can actually decide for itself how to deal with the Holocaust. And in some states, you don't hear anything about the Holocaust. So excuse me, how will you understand how a textbook or how fascism exists or how fascism develops if you never learn about it? So it's important to have a basic understanding. What I try to do is not only to focus on the past, and when I teach and when I give my talks, I really try it, we can do a bit later, but I really try to not, you know, think that everyone has as much knowledge as maybe we do have, because we are educated in sort of an intellectual elite. No, you have to explain it in a very simple way, because those people that you want to reach maybe come from a different background, but still they need to be educated. And what I want to say and why I'm showing the picture is that US Holocaust Memorial, sorry, the teeth in my mouth, it hurts a little bit, I'm sorry. The museum is doing a brilliant job by really doing it in an easy, understandable way. They also teach law enforcement. They just do such a fantastic job that I just would like really you to encourage to if you ever visited it, if you haven't visited it, go there, visit it, and try to, you know, they also have virtual programs where you can, from the comfort of from your chair or your sofa, you can go through the clips. And many of those things that, you know, I would have maybe also emphasized on in my talk, I decided not to say because I'd like to talk about other things. But if you would like to have information, you know, go to the website or visit, if COVID allows that, visit the museum. It's definitely a good choice. And they also have branches all over the United States. Again, please, the next one, Jonathan. This is a final picture. There is another one, but I won't show you this. I'd like to leave you with this picture because this is a picture you probably have no idea what it is. I can't ask you because I won't get an answer. I can't hear you maybe afterwards. So you can't tell me the answer. But look at it. I keep silent for a moment because I really, really want you to have a look at this picture. Do you see how happy I am? And do you see how happy everyone else is? So this picture was shot in Israel. And by going public with my story, I mean, story sounds so ridiculous sometimes to me because it's not a story, it's my life. Okay, but still it's a story. You need to somehow find a term. So I was invited to go to Israel for the Jerusalem Book Fair. And you don't know this yet, we'll talk about this later. Because it was in the introduction, I lived in Israel for a couple of years and I speak fluently Hebrew and I studied at the university. So I have a history with Israel. And when I came back a couple of years ago, I came not back as a student, but I came back as an author and a writer because I was invited to the book fair. And I had made contact with some survivors who had written letters or wrote emails or contacted me. And I had developed a friendship with one of the survivors. And this is when we meet again. This was the second or third time, I think. And she came with me to most of my events. And her name is Rina. And Rina is a survivor from the Schindler's List. So I think this picture is awesome. Imagine, I showed you the picture of my mother full of grief. And I told you the encounter between her and Helen, the maid, former maid in the household von Amon. And now look at this picture. Look at Irena, this is her daughter. And look at me, and look, this is how it should be. And this is, sorry, Bettina Goering, this is, I think, the better choice. So lead by example, and I try as well to do my best. That's it, the monologue. And now I'd like to open the discussion.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. We have a ton of questions, I imagine. I do want to, as I open up the chat section, I do want to ask you, Jennifer, just very briefly, since you wrote the book, I
need my glasses. I want to look at all of you. Now I can see you.
Since you've
Hello, Abraham, Stephen, Norm.
How many people do we have?
Helen, Amy. I can see you. That's lovely.
Jennifer, so how have you in your book, which you document, so you want your emotional relationship to your past is so wonderful, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity for people here to buy the book. It's on Amazon, but it's also at, I'll send a link in a minute to our bookstore here where it's on discount. But have you struggled, do you continue to struggle with the person that was and is Amon Gut in your mind? Do you try to find a humanity in this notorious perpetrator? What is your ongoing relationship? Have you has it sort of stabilized into an understanding that you are not, of course, your grandfather, you are not biology is not destiny, or do you still struggle with this man himself and what he did?
I still struggle with this man and what he did, because what he did was so inhuman. So I will always struggle with it, because it's just, injustice makes me feel terrible. And yeah, but it happened, the discovery, and that everything somehow, everything, it's quite a long time that passed. And by being able to make something good out of it, I would say, it's not that I'm constantly haunted by it. I more see him from I would say, a journalistic or an academic perspective. So I try to study him and try to study who he was and what he did, try to understand also his personality. If he has psychopathic or sociopathic traits, probably has both. Really to understand him as a person and to go away from the personal relationship. And what I didn't emphasized on, why it was also so difficult in the very beginning, is on the one hand, it's my biological grandfather who was a historical figure, and I can see him as a historical figure very often. But I grew up still knowing my biological grandmother, and I told you that I was in an orphanage for so many years. So I had not a lot of close relations to my biological family. There was just my mother who visited me sporadically, and then there was my grandmother. who I dearly, dearly loved as a child. And for me, the most difficult part, I would say, on the journey was, or one of the most difficult parts was somehow to understand that a lot of these feelings that I had came also as from the personal side, because I couldn't understand how my grandmother, my beloved grandmother, was able to love this man. How could she, be such a, I couldn't understand it. First, when we go back to what I explained you with the picture, I had this picture in my hand, I was looking in the mirror, and I was trying to find other similarities. And at one point I knew, okay, I'm different. It was still difficult, but my grandmother, this was far more complicated, because, I mean, she was not convicted after the war. My grandmother, she never went on trial. Amon Good was on trial, he was hanged, he was executed in Poland, not very far from the concentration camp. So somehow there was, for me, also a way of, he's dead. You can let go, you keep it inside to teach about it, but let not affect it yourself so heavily. But with my grandmother, because I mean, she wasn't someone who took a rifle herself, went to the balcony and shot, but she had so much guilt by just being there, being a bystander, even more than a bystander. And the twist or the question, who am I? Would I have behaved like her? This was, all these irrational questions, they were spinning in my head. And sometimes this came back to Amon Good. So it was, the mix between historical figure and then part of the family being the one who my grandmother loved. As you can see in my head now, it's not that you have the possibility to structure your thoughts always. And when I was in that stage, and this is why I try to explain it to you also in a bit complicated way, you can't somehow leave the past behind and say, this has nothing to do with me. So I see him more as a historical figure most of the time when I teach, but in some moments, also my mother, for example, we are not in contact, my biological mother, but her 75th birthday was just very, I don't want to have it here on tape, but it's, actually I can say it because you can read it in the book. It was 2 days ago. So those days are days where it becomes very personal, but it's not something that I'm haunted by.
Sorry about that, Jennifer. So let's take some questions. You have some wonderful feedback here in the chat section, but I am curious, I've been advised to keep people on mute now because it'll be an absolute absolute insanity here. But I, of course, having read the book, I have so many remarks and interesting things to say, but I think Jennifer would very much welcome questions if we want to go on a little bit. This is what somebody says: I love how you pointed out that we get to decide the people we're going to be. I always thought it was so sad that Hitler's relatives decided not to have kids because they wanted to end the Hitler lineage. They could choose to be different and have kids that they raised to be different. Yeah, so I think that's very powerful. But what's interesting to me too is that obviously we still have this presumption that there is some part of our grandparents pulsating through us. I think that's one of the most powerful parts of your book, is that you can sort of have to fight against that. Have you studied Yiddish? Somebody asked. German, English, and Hebrew. Have you studied Yiddish?
No, but while living in Israel, you come across Yiddish regularly by families that I was close to, some of the older people, they do speak Yiddish, but I don't speak Yiddish now. I do understand because it's very similar to German. I mean, a little bit Polish, but I do understand some Yiddish, yes, but I don't speak Yiddish.
So tell me.
I speak some Arabic. No, actually, I don't speak Arabic, but I did study Arabic at university, so I'm able to translate. And I need to work on my skills, but yeah, this is maybe a fancy language, but no Yiddish.
Jennifer, Rachel Shankman asks, how has your history impacted your children?
Well, there's the personal aspect, and also on a broader sense. I mean, my children, they are German. And as I said before, in German, Holocaust education is mandatory. So they know a lot about the Holocaust, not only because we talk about it in the family, but also because it's widely talked about in school. They are normal teenagers, even though they are now almost grown-ups, and they have a completely normal life. They are interested, but they are not so interested, I would say, from the historical perspective, but more on the human side. I mean, again, for me, what was so difficult for me to grasp was how people can be like this. How can you kill millions of people? It's impossible just to think about it. And my kids are the same, because besides school, I try to teach them things. And as I said, empathy, all these values, ethic values, they play an essential role in my family's life. So the kids are, I think they are dealing with it okay. They know it's a responsibility, as a responsibility they have as a German, because it's part of German history and part, unfortunately, of German heritage now. But also they know that it's part of their family history. But it's not that we talk about it a lot. Sometimes they ask something, but it's not that I always, push the subject forward and try to communicate. No, I always waited until they asked something, which was, I think, a good way of dealing with it. So, yeah.
We have a couple other questions. First of all, I want to just mention to people that this will be, if you have to leave early, we have until 1:30 our time, which is that's 8:30 in Hamburg, where you are, and then we'll stop. But obviously, some students and others have to go. This full recording will be available on the website of the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center in not too long from now. So if you have to go, you can see the rest, but we want to take advantage of your being here, Jennifer, until then. And somebody has asked whether you did talk about this with your grandma.
No, I couldn't. My grandmother passed away when I was a child.
Oh.
I couldn't. This is also, I mean, again, it's my life, but it's a story I quickly want to share with you what happened, because you don't know. Well, when I was 7 years old, I told you I was adopted, so I didn't see my mother, and my grandmother, I didn't see her either. And when I was 12 years old, my adoptive family, my parents, they told me that my grandmother has passed away. They didn't know anything about the circumstances at that point. They just read it in the newspaper. Not an article, but I don't know how you call it.
Obituary?
Help me.
Obituary.
Yeah. So they just told me, and, I didn't know anything. But when I read or discovered the book about my mother, I got a lot of new facts and much more information, because what had happened was that my grandmother had agreed on participating in a documentary, not the documentary that I showed you before with my mother, Inheritance. It was a documentary that was shot before the movie Schindler's List came into the movies. And the documentary, the idea was to collect voices of people who had experienced the time from different viewpoints. It was not just my grandmother. There was also, for example, the widow of Oskar Schindler they interviewed, and all kind of other people who had memories they thought they needed to be shared. And my grandmother participated in the documentary, and she had a team of a film team in her house to shoot the interview. And this was the final interview that my grandmother gave, because just hours later she took an overdose and she died the same night. And my mother found her the next day. So I never had the opportunity to talk to her. But it's also something that I learned on the way. When you deal, or when you have to deal with your past, if you deal with people, with emotions, with relationship, it's not sometimes necessary that these people are alive, because you can't decide it for yourself. If someone is gone, you still have to go through the process without the other one. And this makes it sometimes even more difficult. With my grandmother, I would have loved to ask her so many questions, because what I remembered about her when I was a child, and what I realized after reading the book about my mother and what kind of role she had played during the Holocaust, this was almost impossible for me to bring these two identities, I would even say, together, and still she's the same person. So I couldn't talk to her. I couldn't solve this problem with her face to face, but it made me think a lot about it. And also the question, you know, am I alike? Even if I wouldn't shoot someone, would I act like her? All these questions. And what was, I think, from the emotional point of view, really difficult was that since having a childhood that was not easy, I'd say there were other circumstances. The only thing that had been left for me was the memory of my grandmother. And suddenly this was shattered as well. So there were different, you know, different angles, I would say, regarding the difficulties in coming to terms with my grandmother. But why she's also so important, not only from my personal perspective to think about her or study her, is that she so much represents the vast majority of people who are bystanders, people who support the system. And my grandmother, I mean, bystander is probably, one could also use different terms, but I just say bystander because she was legally not convicted. I do think that she was guilty, no doubt about it, because if you don't do anything, I do think you're guilty as well. But let's put her to categorize her to make it easier into the group of bystanders. And again, my grandmother, and by the story, is an example. It's a general, it's a universal story. My grandmother represents the vast majority of people who are bystanders. And sorry, I have to come back to nowadays, because we have to make the switch from the past to the present to the future. If something is wrong, it's not enough to say nothing. That's not enough. And my grandmother did exactly this. She sat in the villa in Krakow, shutting out every noise, and just continued to live a luxurious life. And there is a very famous scene as well in the movie. It's of course not my grandmother, but the actress who portrays my grandmother. You see her in the movie, and when Amon Good is walking onto the balcony in the morning to shoot people from the balcony, you see in the scene my grandmother, and she's in bed, and she's pulling the blanket over her head, and she says, Amon, don't be so loud, I can't stand that noise. Something like this. You know, impossible. So my grandmother, on the one hand, the memories that I had from the childhood, and then the person that she also was, these two different aspects of personality. This was something, you know, I had to think about very deeply. And one of the things that I'd like to share with you is that I think, you know, when you look at, for example, Amon Good or other you know, figures where it's so easy to say this is evil. People tend to say, okay, he was evil, he was such a devil. It's not what he did that this was not evil. I mean, he did so many evil things, but evil is not something that is laid upon a person, you know, in a religious sense. There's Satan and there's the angel. People are human. And again, you decide who you want to be and who you want to become. You have both inside. You have both sides inside everyone, and you decide if you go for the good or if you go for the bad. And sometimes we make good decisions, sometimes we make bad decisions. But a small singular decision is not decisions like decisions who are crucial. And in the case of my grandmother, the decision to stay with Amon Good, with my biological grandfather, in the villa, shutting eyes and her ears, it's completely unacceptable.
Jennifer, I actually, in your book, your powerful relationship with your grandmother is also in the book. And somebody asked also about the conversations with your mother, but I will actually hold that off and let people read about it, because I have some, we just have a little, about 13 more minutes. There was one person who asked how we can see the documentary, I guess both the one with your grandma, but also the one with your mother.
With my grandmother, I don't think you can watch it. I had contacted later someone from the BBC, because it was done by the BBC, and there is material, but even I haven't seen everything. I just got the transcript, because obviously you can imagine, I mean, my grandmother killed herself after the interview, so I wanted to know what she said. Well, she was also very sick at that point. She had a lung disease, so she might also have killed her for other reasons. But I wanted to know, and I also wanted to know if she ever understood what she did and what happened. If there was any kind of, you know, I'm sorry or something. So I try to, you know, find the documentary, but the whole documentary is very difficult to get. You have the opportunity to see it within a larger context. I don't know exactly. I can try to send you a link, Jonathan, later on. There is something, it's not on YouTube, but there are some DVDs still existing. I have one at home, and there you can see small clips. And this was also, for example, so striking, because when I watched it for the very first time, I remember I saw my grandmother last when I was 7 years old. And then I watched the DVD and I saw my grandmother sitting there in a chair. And she was exactly, because she was not older than how I had remembered her for all these years. So very, very awkward. Anyhow, and the movie, so you can find it pieces, and I tried to send you a link. And Inheritance is still, there are still movies out, but I don't think you find it on stream or YouTube or something, but I'll check.
Okay.
I'll check for you, and I'll try to send you a link.
I'm gonna, by the way, I'm going to download the chat. There's so many wonderful comments, Jennifer. So I'll make sure you get a PDF of all the comments people are saying and the reactions. But I do have a question.
Jonathan, I'm so sorry. I know this is so unprofessional, but I have only 5%. I need to get my charger.
Ah, okay.
Just in case. Give me a second, okay?
Okay, or we can work off your 5%. Or all right, go get your charger.
I rather get my charger. I don't want to be off. Okay,
right.
So
you got it.
I'm off for a second. Sorry.
That's okay. And while I will recommend a book if you are interested in this story. It's there is the son of a perpetrator named Hans Frank. He was the barbaric leader of the general government of Poland. He was the Nazi put in charge of the area in Poland where most of the death camps were. His son, he was hanged in Nuremberg. His son is named Nicholas Frank, F-R-A-N-K, Nicholas with a K. I don't remember the English translation, but he also struggles with the legacy of his father. His father actually having said Heil Hitler the moment before he was hanged in Nuremberg. And this is one of the most powerful books I've read about children and fathers. And in this case, we have Jennifer talking about her grandfather, but Nicholas Frank is also, I'm just telling everybody, Jennifer, about Nicholas Frank's book, which is of course very powerful indictment of his own father as well. But I will, Hans Frank's.
You said you told the story about the wallet?
No.
No? You want to hear it?
Sure.
So Nicholas Frank is a little bit, I would say, comparable to my mother, about the second generation, the generation who is full of guilt, who actually, I think, has not yet made the transition from second generation to fourth generation to what's coming, you know, to try to teach the aspect of explaining prevention, what happens, you know, anyhow. So Nicholas Frank is a little bit in the same, I would say, category to see, and he has a very disturbed relationship with his father, who is obviously also already gone. He's dead, but he is so much identifies with the family history and can't let go. He's full of hate, and his message actually is not a message of hope, but it's so destructive because he has a photograph of his father in his wallet. And it's not just any photograph, it's a photograph of his father with a broken neck. He was hanged as well. So this is a picture that he has in his wallet, and he says, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he looks at it every day. And I don't, you know, we shall not forget, but I don't think this is the way one should do it.
There's, by the way, somebody just posted that you can stream the movie with, I don't know if it's the same one, but Inheritance, I gather somebody posted, you can stream it on Hulu. I don't know.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, we have just time for a couple more. I will ask you one, and then I see another one. Do you think a lot about your own relationship to your grandfather in terms of your being a Black woman and his being sort of, in a sense, fighting for a cause that was fundamentally about white nationalism or the so-called Nordic ideal? Is that part of your own struggle too, your own identity? That this, and it's an irony, of course. Your story is filled with ironies, but how does that fit in?
The question is a little bit complicated. I try to simplify it because I want to give you an answer, a quick answer. Well, my identity being Black, played a role. First of all, because it made me, it has two aspects. First of all, it's a protection, because when you're Black now, I can distance myself more from my biological grandfather. Also people who or I'm dealing with, for example, with survivors. So being Black was really very helpful because I'm not like my mother that when they see her, for example, they can hardly watch her or talk to her because she reminds them so much of Amon Good. And my color is sort of a protection shield because this makes me also from the outside being different. But I want to go into being Black and dealing with the past, because I think the connection that I'd like to make quickly is that in the United States, you never really, I would say, excuse me, but unfortunately it's the truth. If you look at Montgomery, where we have the issue with how do we deal with your slavery past in the US? Do you really acknowledge it? Or do you pretend that it never happened? Or how's the narrative? The narrative is, I would say, not maybe the way it should be, because you need to acknowledge what happened, and they have done a really good job, I think, Montgomery, with the museum and the idea of, for example, if you have a monument that you don't have to tear down a monument, you don't have to do it, but you can, for example, create something else as that counterbalance it to make history right, or really change the narrative to make history right. So being Black and being interested in these matters was always, part, and I think it will be more important, not only for me, but also for society, and for you, for the American society. I think as well, my father coming from Nigeria, this part of my identity was something that I explored only recently. I mean, I've been to African countries before, but I traveled to Nigeria for the very first time with my father, by the way, and some of my family members from my father's side, and try to see how is Nigeria going back to the roots. And this was very interesting, and you can't ignore part of your identity, and you can't ignore part of your history as Americans. So for us Germans who were forced after the Second World War, not only by our allies by the US, but not allies by our friends, the US, but other countries after the Second World War, to deal with our history. This is something that never happened in the US, I think, on a proper level. So I think in this regard, you can learn from the Germans, and you probably should learn from the Germans, but it doesn't need to be in a missionary way. You can do it your way, but it needs to be done, because otherwise, if we talk, for example, about Black Lives Matter, it's not something that will disappear. It will haunt you. You need to deal with the history, whether it's in our case, in the German case, it's the Nazi past, or in your case, for example, it's the slavery past. So it's a very dear matter to me. So insofar, the color of my skin definitely, is why I'm also very, drawn to this subject.
Well, it's good having you here in particular in Alabama, because some of the people you're talking to right now are involved in this very project.
I'd love to be in contact.
The Equal Justice Initiative is, and part of the museum and memorial are very much about, here in Alabama, about, in some ways, taking cues from Germany. Brian Stevens.
Yeah, I'm preparing something, so let's stay in contact.
And some of the people who are watching you now have been, while they haven't been to Germany per se, they've been inspired by Brian Stevenson, who himself, of the Equal Justice Initiative, who himself was inspired by Germany. And so there's so much that's resonant with what you say. So I really, there's so much more. There are questions, there are comments, but Jennifer, I want to, on behalf of the UAB College of Arts and Sciences, the UAB Department of History, the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, and the Saul Kimerling Endowment, or the Rita Kimerling Endowment rather, and Saul Kimerling and his family. I want to thank you. It was such a fantastic presentation, and we were really honored to have you here. And as perhaps if we continue these discussions about a memory and national and personal memory, we can bring you here again.
Yeah, you know, after COVID, everything is possible. And as I just said, I'm really interested in that subject, Montgomery. People from Montgomery who are involved in the work will definitely talk again, because, yeah, I think we as German, maybe it's payback time, maybe we can help you in one way or the other.
Thank you.
It was really a pleasure, and I just put on my glasses because I want to see the names. Mason, for example, John, I see Abraham, I can see you. Jacqueline, no, she's gone. Ashley, but it's so lovely. Yeah, and I see a heart from Maria. Thank you. It was really so nice to be, even if I was not in person in Alabama. It was nice spending time with you, and maybe we'll do it again.
All right, and with that, we will sign out and thank you, Jennifer, and get some sleep. It is bedtime for you, I think.
Yeah, sort of. No, that's okay.
All right, take good care, everyone.
Take good care. Thank you. Bye.